We want to welcome you to the Customer Success Trust Framework webinar brought to you by Client Success. I'm Brent Peterson, a Customer Success Strategist at Client Success. Client Success is a customer success management platform that helps leaders and CSMs retain and grow their customer base. During today's webinar, we'll discuss how to build trust with customers and how trust can help decrease churn even when product gaps and executive sponsor turnover threaten to make things more difficult. It's my pleasure to welcome Ed Powers, Vice President of Customer Success at simPRO. Ed, welcome.
Hey, welcome. Good to be with you today. Thanks, Brent.
Yeah, we're excited for it. As you can see, we'll start by introducing relationship and trust factors. Then we will cover how trust forms. We'll talk about 5 critical trust moments and where to start when creating trust. So today's format is open for your participation, and we will be reading comments and answering questions as we can through the presentation and after the presentation is over. So feel free to use the Q&A box to submit both comments and questions today throughout the presentation. Feel free to use the hashtag customer success to involve the customer success community on Twitter. Ed, we're excited to learn about trust today.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Brett. Just a little bit about myself. I'm VP of Customer Success for a company called simPRO, and we are an Australian company that makes software for the trades. So for plumbers and electricians and HVAC. The company has been very successful in Australia, New Zealand, and in the UK, and now we're starting up operations here in the US, so we're really excited about that. And if you happen to know anybody who's in the trades industry, who's looking for more growth, wealth, and freedom, please have them call us. We'd love to talk to them.
Awesome. Well, Ed, before we start with the presentation, I think we ought to start with an audience poll. So we'll go ahead and launch a poll here in the webinar. Questions are above, and you'll find that poll there in a pop-up window. And we'll give it just a minute for some results here. So Ed, our poll is about the most frequent causes of churn. Do you have some thoughts, comments about the most frequent causes of churn?
Yeah, these are ones that I think people will see typically more often. I think a lot of folks out there in the audience probably do a little bit of a survey or mark down churn causes when their customers decide to cancel their subscriptions. And so we're trying to get a sense here, I think, of what do people feel are the most frequent causes for churn, maybe from their own experience. And I think we'll kind of compare this with what is generally seen in the industry.
Okay, awesome. And responses are rolling in here. We're at about 70% of the people. We have responses from about 70% here. Ed, what do you think about the results so far?
Well, let's see here. Typically what we will see is that the lack of product quality or value is typically in the 60 to 75% range. That's typically the most frequent cause are product-related issues. So whether there's an issue with the value of the offering or the quality, reliability of the product itself. A lot of times from our own personal experience, we may cancel subscriptions to various things because we're just not happy with the product, or we don't think it's priced right or overpriced or things like that. Here looks like lack of relationship is also very high in the poll, which is great. That is also a major driver. In fact, in consumer-based companies, lack of relationship or a bad relationship many times is the primary cause of why people will churn. And ease of switching, no longer need the product, that's about right. That's pretty much the percentages that you'll see. The ease of switching has to do with the nature of the product. Are you one of many, or are you one of a kind when it comes to your offering? If you're a commodity, it's usually pretty easy to switch. If you're the only game in town, that does impact whether or not people can switch from you. And then we've all seen the cases where our customers, maybe some have some financial difficulty or go out of business, or maybe they make a strategic shift in their business and they no longer need the product and they go off in a different direction. So I think these top two are pretty representative of what we see across the board.
So what does this mean for customer success professionals?
Well, it's it's interesting. We probably can't impact ease of switching or no longer need the product. I mean, that's kind of outside our control. The ease of switching really is a market dynamic. It's about the industry we play in. We certainly can impact product quality and value. Obviously, one of the key responsibilities of customer success is to make sure that customers get value from their product, especially in the early stages. So we can certainly impact the top one there, and lack of relationship is also something we can have a profound impact on. So many times, however, the relationship, the quality of the relationship that we have is overlooked by tech companies, and that's really what we're going to be talking about today.
Great. Well, maybe you can help us understand what aspects of the relationship are important.
Yeah, and there's been some really interesting research on this topic. Some studies have shown that the level of trust that a customer has in a supplier tracks very closely with their level of loyalty. And that's especially true when customers perceive buying risk, when there's a risky relationship with a supplier. When those levels of trust are high, renewing tends to be a no-brainer. People do business with people they know, like, and trust, and researchers call this affective commitment. They continue with a supplier because they want to continue with that supplier. On the other hand, when trust is low, researchers call this calculative commitment. So rather than just renew automatically, they'll say, hey, wait a minute, let's look at who else is in the market. Let's compare all the options here, look at the costs and benefits. There's a lot of cognitive, cycles that get burned in trying to figure out, do we stick with the supplier that we have or do we switch to someone else? And there's also some other studies that show that there's a bit of a halo effect. So when those levels of trust are high, customers seem to be a lot more forgiving of suppliers. As opposed to when those levels of trust are low, people will jump on that and say, well, here we go again. It's interesting because there's actually a biological tie to all of this. When people feel a strong sense of trust, the body actually releases a hormone called oxytocin. And people with these elevated levels of oxytocin actually change their thinking and their behaviors. And that makes people more caring, more understanding, and they typically are more generous with other people. Paul Zak wrote a really great book on this subject called The Moral Molecule, and he walks through how oxytocin really is something that is part of our human experience. And when we feel this trust, it actually is something that builds stronger bonds with people and is part of who we are as humans.
It's amazing, and it's wonderful that you can tie biology even into building relationships. So Ed, I guess the next question we need to talk about here is what makes up trust? Mm-hmm. And as you talk about this a little bit, we'd love to hear from the audience comments about aspects of trust that you find important or questions that you'd like for us to answer. But Ed, if you can start off, what makes up trust?
Yeah, and I'd be curious to see what people chat in with here. Yeah, for Priscilla, authenticity, vulnerability, all good. Confidence, that's terrific. Experience, transparency, listening, knowledge. These are all really, really good. If we go to the next slide, psychologists tell us that trust really boils down into three fundamental factors, and a lot of the ones that our audience has indicated fall under these. So the first is ability, which is competence, predictability, consistency, knowing what to expect. That's the ability portion of that. Benevolence is caring, goodwill, empathy, commitment to shared values, shared goals, those kinds of things. Integrity, we all probably have that on our corporate values, things like fairness and objectivity, honesty, open communication, I think was mentioned. So these are all kind of the fundamental elements of trust. And if you think about this, it's a good test to say, well, do you trust your doctor, right? So let's test that assumption. Is your doctor a capable healer? Do they have that ability? Do they genuinely care about you? Are they benevolent? And if you have to get some tough news, are they going to shoot straight with you? That has to do with integrity. So chances are pretty good you do trust your doctor because they meet these criteria. And the same really is true when it comes to business.
And some great comments there by the audience. Thanks, Ed. How do people come to trust each other then?
Yeah, and this is something that's really interesting. There's a psychologist by the name of Luke Chang, and on this next slide, what he ran was a really interesting experiment using something called the trust game. And the trust game is an investment game where subjects invest money into this game, and they can either do it by themselves and get a small rate of return, or they can invest with other people and get much higher higher returns, like 4 times the number of returns. But there's a catch in all of this. Some players are more trustworthy than others. So in the game, about some players will return the gains from that investment 80% of the time, while others will return only about 20% of the time. And this chart kind of shows what was observed in this experiment. For those that were high on trustworthy scale, people would invest more money. The y-axis is actually the average amount of money that they would invest, and the x-axis is the number of turns in the game. And people would figure that out pretty quickly, is that, oh, these people are more trustworthy, so therefore I'm going to up the amount that I bet in this game. And then over time, over multiple turns, they wind up investing more money with the more trustworthy and less with the less trustworthy. So this really shows very clearly that trust is a function of reinforcement learning. So we learn to trust people, brands, technologies, much the same way that we learn everything else in life. It's through reinforcement iteration. The neurons have to fire over and over again before the chemistry in the synapses starts to change and retains that information. So this is a natural, normal learning process that we see. And on the next slide, the other thing that's really interesting about Luke Chang's work is that during the experiment, they found something that was really compelling, is that they could very easily influence what people would do in the experiment in the initial phases. So what they would do is they would imply that one player was more trustworthy than others, for example, and people would tend to act on that belief. This is a phenomenon that's called anchoring, and we all do this. Whenever we're faced with a new experience, what we do is the brain subconsciously tries to figure out, well, what's this like? I'm going to set a reference point, and then I'm going to measure my experience against that reference point. So we all do this anchoring, and we're very suggestible at the very early stages of the relationship. Then once we make up our minds on that initially, we tend to stick with that belief. And this is another phenomenon that we're all guilty of. It's called confirmation bias. And what that means is we tend to notice information that supports our beliefs, and we tend to ignore information that contradicts those beliefs. So once we have an idea in our head, we have to see contrary evidence over and over and over again before we start to say, well, maybe I'm wrong about that. So, so the initial trust is quite profound on what happens in that whole relationship, is how do people perceive that. In the very beginning tends to dominate how they behave down the stretch.
That's very interesting. How would a customer success professional then apply this to their work?
Well, it's important to note that what starts right stays right. We all are, as customer success professionals, we all want to take the ball from our salespeople and start, educating the customer, getting them successful as quickly as possible, reduce that time to value. But at the same time, we need to keep in mind that this is also the time where customers are making up their minds about whether they can trust you. And what happens in the early stages of that relationship is critically important. So we need to focus as much attention on building trust in the early stages as we are trying to deliver that initial value.
Awesome. Well, we're going to go back to the audience, and we have another poll here about the best way to build trust. While we launch that poll and give our audience a minute to respond here, I'd like to offer the chance for you as well, while you're responding to that poll, to ask some questions. I'm sure that this research that we've discussed and these ideas have brought some questions to mind. Send us some of those questions, and we will get to those a little bit later on in the presentation. And we will give it just a minute longer here to get some results from this poll.
Yeah, and Brent, there's probably a lot of ways. These are some suggestions. There's probably a lot of ways that people can think about trust, and you know, it's something that we certainly all experience in our personal relationships. This is trying to apply this towards our business relationships as well.
Excellent. Well, we're sharing the results with the poll now there, so hopefully everyone can see those. Pretty startling contrast here, Ed. Very clear winner to most chosen answer here. What thoughts do you have about these results?
We have a very smart audience. All these particular questions, these are all good ideas, and I think people want to do that as part of their day-to-day business. But you know, show the company that you can be trusted is really important. You know, in writing, they always say, don't tell, you want to show people. And that's exactly the same thing in our relationships with our customers, is that we have to show them. We can't just assume that they will see that. So very smart audience. That's exactly what we're going to focus on next. So how do you build trust? Well, it's really important to keep this in mind. The key is not to leave things to chance. You know, we can, when we interact with people personally, you know, we kind of, trust will build on its own. It's about the nature of our relationship and the character that we are and the character of the other people that we interact with. But imagine if we could, you know, apply this whole notion of reinforcement learning and systematically work to drive up the customer's trust in us by giving them some love along the way. I mean, literally, how would we do that? This is what we'll be talking about next, is how do we create an opportunity systematically that demonstrates or shows to our customers that we can be trusted.
And I think this kind of the formula or the, you know, the key steps will be critical to know. So maybe you can share those with us.
Yeah, absolutely. What I like to refer to is 5 critical moments in the customer experience. And we may interact, you know, hundreds of times with customers throughout the life cycle. But it turns out there's really 5 types of interactions that are really impactful. And let me go through each one of these things. The first is a moment of connection. We all, when we meet someone for the first time or we're having a new experience, we need to determine, is this person a friend or a foe? You know, is this someone in my tribe or someone else's? We want to feel comfortable with people. We want to understand where they're from. You know, imagine if you're at a cocktail party and having small talk. Everybody does this. You want to find out, you know, who are you? How do we know you? What do you do for a living? Where do you live? You know, where'd you go to school? We're looking at things that we have in common. And subconsciously, we're much more comfortable with people who are like us. So a moment of connection is that time when we can focus on that and show commonality, is to say, hey, we're just like you. So that's the first one. The second is a moment of power. This is where we can help the customer increase mastery, autonomy, and choice. When we feel that we can affect outcomes, when we have a sense of personal power, again, we feel safer. We feel like we can impact the world, and that makes us feel much more comfortable. So power involves things like ability, making choices. So when customers feel like they don't have a choice, they're going to react negatively. So how can we give customers a small number of choices, not an overwhelming set, but what can we do to give customers a choice in the matter and to decide what happens next? Another critical moment is a moment of proof. Learning occurs when you compare an outcome with what you expected. So when we take a minute really to step back and to show a customer that we kept our promises, then we reinforce that learning. So for example, we told you you'd save 20% going with us. Well, we lied. It's actually 26.5%, right? So it's going back to show customers, this is what we promised, this is what we did. The next major critical moment is a moment of wow. And this is doing something that's just out of the ordinary, a surprise, a delight. Whenever we experience something that is delightful and surprising, we get a rush of dopamine in our brains. And this is a very powerful, feel-good hormone that enables our learning. And during these moments, we really get a sense that someone cares about us. It's that benevolence again. You do something unexpected and very nice and thoughtful, and you say, wow, that was really cool. I didn't expect that. The last one is a moment of truth. Customers are most vulnerable when there's a very serious problem, and how we respond in those times really, really matters. As they say, adversity reveals character, and it's exactly the same in business. So subconsciously, we're all wired for all of these responses, but these are the moments that if we do a good job, a very systematic way of delivering in each of these areas, customers really feel a deep sense of trust with us. So that's an overview of the critical moments that we want to create in the experiences that our customers have with us.
Well, that's great. And yeah, this is another point where I'd love to hear, we would love to hear from our audience here. Ed, you mentioned that the first moment, critical moment, was a moment of connection. And you said that's when you build relationships through commonality. I'd love to see some ideas here in our chat and question box about how are you building moments of connection with your customers. And as some of those roll in, we can comment on them. But Ed, maybe I can just ask you, how might you create a moment of connection?
Yeah, and I think it's, if we go back to the analogy of the cocktail party for the first time, what is it that we can do to make people feel at home? And the best time to do that is when we're meeting someone for the first time. So imagine the welcome call that you do, very first conversation you have. How do you do that? Finding common interests, great suggestion there. A smile, a warm, welcoming hello. We do these things naturally in social environments, but a lot of times in the heat of the day, and we're going through our work, we don't take us a minute to step back and say, gee, how do we make this a warm experience for people? Share what's going on. Look for, a trick is to look at someone's LinkedIn profile. A lot of times in LinkedIn, you can learn a lot about someone, where they went to school or where they're from, break the ice, stories of success. One really interesting method is simply to put a photograph in your signature line of your emails. And it sounds kind of strange, but when people can see your face, when they have a sense about who they are, they will connect with you more personally than if they don't. So even including like a photograph is a way to build connection. Customer communities is another way, where people can connect with other people who are just like them. Memberships, if you have a membership or a club that you offer, and you have customers that can get together and compare notes, and they're in the same boat, that also builds connection. So a lot of really good experiences here. Work with clients around the world. Justin is saying this, would try to build moments by discussing the client's job and their goals. Exactly. What are you all about? What are you trying to achieve? You have a lot of shared experiences. That's great. So some really good suggestions in here.
And these, you know, to a certain extent, Ed, I think we are preaching to the choir. In my experience, working with customer success professionals, generally speaking, find them to be very good at these sorts of things. But it does take some deliberate effort, and there's always a way to do it with, you know, one more person, one more sponsor or user, one more client, and make a difference.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it's you know, we a lot of times we'll forget about the fact that we're all people. You know, we're people. Our customers are people. You know, there's client success and there's simPRO and there's all these different brands, and you know, there's affiliation with these brands. But at the end of the day, it's not about, you know, um, client success. It's about Brent. You know, it's I know Brent. He's a good guy. He happens to work for client success. So, you know, the time that we can let the barriers down here and really connect with each other personally, just spending a little bit of extra time doing that, having some small talk, getting that relationship warmed up at the very beginning pays huge dividends.
Excellent. Well, let's take a minute here and talk about the moment of proof then. And a moment of proof, as you've said, Ed, is when you show that you keep your promises, show that the results you've promised are delivered, those sorts of things. Any other comments about the moment of proof?
Yeah, I'm curious to see how folks in our audience are doing this. I mean, what obviously comes to mind are things like quarterly business reviews, but there's some really clever ways that you can do this along the way. You know, a part of that whole process, you know, customer acquisition is about making promises. And after the sale, it's all about keeping those promises. So how can you show your customers, how are you showing your customers that you are in fact keeping those promises? And underscoring that so that they get it. Okay, I did get these results. I did meet my goals. You did deliver what you promised. So there are some really interesting ways of doing this, and hopefully we've got some folks chatting in some thoughts on that.
And you know, these moments of proof, I expect, would be a little different, a little more different depending on the type of service or product offered. Don here says that I usually send notification when I get something done within the time frame. So maybe that's an email or a message of some sort that actually states that here's what you asked for and here's what I've delivered.
And Sam talked about metrics. Yeah, if you can have a dashboard that shows them, you know, some metrics that are important to them and how they're tracking against those metrics, that's a really good suggestion. In fact, you know, there's WebRoot, and it's probably the same true of some other security companies. When you have your antivirus software, a lot of times it'll pop up and it'll say, you know, here's the number of threats that we neutralized for you. You know, a little report that pops up every once in a while. You know, those are the kinds of things, health checks, as Elena talks about. You know, all these kinds of things where you can show tangible proof of here's what you wanted, here's what we're delivering, and you know, this is the value that you're getting from the product. So that's a really good example as well.
Now, Don made an interesting comment here. He said some proof points of trust would include 1, giving someone a refund or credit they didn't know was due, or 2, recommending a competitor's product when more appropriate. And those are very specific and very good ideas here. And then Megan mentioned the idea of upfront mutual agreements in writing.
Yep.
And then following up to those agreements.
Yep. Yeah, you know, it's funny. A lot of times people will sign those contracts and they stick them in their filing cabinet and they don't pull them out until it's time to say, oh, geez, or you know, is it time for renewal? They don't ever go back to them. And being able to track, this is in our scope of work. Here's what we promised, here's what we did, having a mechanism that goes back and really, points to each one of those terms in the agreement that you actually checked off. Making that a living document is really a great idea.
Awesome. And I'll read a couple of these others off because there's some great things in here. Justin said, ensure your client is never unsure about the product status or project status.
Mm-hmm.
It's a wonderful idea. Other comments include provide authentic customer reviews and let customers see how quickly you react to problems or issues.
Excellent.
And Ernie says, listen to them closely, follow up in a short amount of time with action items, send proactive emails with tips and tricks, set company alerts, and acknowledge news events about their company, congratulating them. All great ideas.
That's excellent.
Well, if you have more comments about proofs, go ahead and send those in. We will be happy to continue talking about that for a second. And now we've reached a more open part of the presentation here. We would love to answer some more questions. I imagine that the research that has been presented and the ideas have spawned some questions, so we'll give those a minute to roll in. And while we do that, I'll read off a couple more ideas here. Don says, advise a client if they could get your product or service at a lower price point. Very interesting there. And make a celebration when key value points are hit and make it a big deal. Also a very interesting idea. So Ed, Dana would love if we could spend a bit more time on the power moment. Could we go back and talk about the power moment for a minute?
Sure. Yeah, moments of power are when people get a sense of capability, ability. I think the most obvious place where that happens in customer success is probably when we do training. And when customers have a chance to start using the software, where they come to a realization of, hey, I can really do this. I can really make the software work the way I want it to. And one trick that we might think about, and something we use around here at simPRO, is an I do, we do, you do approach. So when we're training a customer or we're training a new employee, we use the same process. The I do is let me do this and you watch what I'm doing. The we do is I'm going to do a piece of this and you do a piece of it, and we do that together. And the third one is you do it and then I will watch. And then I'll give you feedback about how that works. So having those kind of iterated as you're training a customer or showing somebody how to use something, we probably all have the experiences when we've demonstrated a product remotely and we're talking and we're clicking through and we have no idea if the other customer is even there anymore. So that's a little trick to say, okay, I'll show you this, but let's do this next one together and let me give you control of the mouse and you go ahead and do this. So when they go through and they actually do that, and they have a rush, that makes them feel really good as well. It's like, wow, I can really do this. And it's not important that we show. It's really important that they show and that they demonstrate and that they're successful. So when we give them those little moments where they can actually do it and see the results, that is huge. That is giant. So training is one area I think that works really well for more moments of power. The other is to give people choice, as I mentioned before. When people can determine outcomes, that gives them a sense of power. And a lot of times they won't tell you this. They won't a lot of times indicate how they feel. But deep down, emotionally, subconsciously, when they have these experiences, that is something that is meaningful to them, and that all contributes to this sense of trust.
That's great. Now, Lindley has a question here. She says that her clients have a dedicated resource for the project and a separate resource for the entire life cycle. And the question is, how do we continue building trust even when there's a bit of a switch in the main point of contact?
That is a great question. And it is something to pay very close attention to. Generally, it's just like all of us. When we meet someone new, we have to reset everything, right? So one thing that we do here at simPRO is we bring in the customer success manager, right? We do a warm handoff from the salespeople, and they act as the quarterback, and we start building that relationship right away. Even though we have a professional services person that steps in and then does the next phase, the CSM is the one who begins that relationship and stays connected as we bring in people at different parts of the relationship. So yes, when you do have these handoffs, just like when we meet someone new, we have to go back to those moments of connection and start to build that relationship. It is possible, if everybody's consistent and they understand the process of building trust and everyone plays their role in that, then the customer steps back and has an experience of, wow, everyone there I interacted with, I can trust. They're all wonderful people. But there are other companies that don't pay a whole lot of attention, and they throw it over the wall, and someone new calls the customer the next day and goes on business as usual, and they don't take a step back and rebuild that trust. So a lot of times we need to be cognizant of the experience that our customers are having, and know what's natural and normal for them is what's natural and normal for us. And if we respond, if our processes are set up in such a way that when we have one of those handoffs, we go back to square one, because that's where the customer is right now. And if we're understanding that and delivering that experience, then we're fine.
Awesome. Now, Don has a great question here about how to maintain trust when an item can't be completed as promised due to something unforeseen.
Mm-hmm.
If there's something we can't deliver, or a promise that we made that has been broken, or a timeline has slipped, how do we still maintain trust?
Well, I think it goes back to that integrity, right? You want to share the news, whether it's good or bad. Shoot straight with people, and I think people appreciate that. And if you do it in such a way as to be, hey, I'm afraid to have some bad news here. We had a situation come up. We had committed to this particular deliverable or timeline. Unfortunately, here's our situation. And I know this is disappointing for you. It's disappointing for us. But we thought you should know what our situation is, and let's talk about how we can get through that and what adjustments we need to make. So I think if you're constructive and you shoot straight and you show integrity, people get it. People know that things don't always go according to plan. It's the same in their lives. And as long as we do it in a careful, in a very clear and direct manner, in a way that we care, customers will cut us some slack.
Awesome. And if I've understood what you've been presenting so far, it's that all of these moments of trust and everything we do to build trust does make a difference when something unforeseen happens.
Exactly. And we almost have to be attentive to building trust, because, stuff happens. There's always going to be something in that relationship. And if we leave things to chance, then we don't know what the reaction is. But if we focus on the early stages of the relationship and systematically build that level of trust, then when we hit those bumps in the road, and we all do, people will be in a position where they'll say, I get it. It's, software is complicated. Things happen. Brent's a good guy. He stood with me before. He's shoot straight with me. I feel good about this. It's okay. Now, if it keeps happening over and over and over again, I might change my thinking. Again, back to that experiment in trust, is that when I make up my mind, I'll stick with that unless I see a lot of evidence that says, that's not true anymore. So it's almost like, we, in the past, maybe 10, 15 years ago, there was a lot of discussion about emotional bank accounts, right? In our relationships with our significant others, is that we have to make these deposits to their emotional bank account. We have to do things to invest in the relationship, because at some point in the time, we're going to have to take a withdrawal. And if we withdraw too much from that account, then we're negative and we have serious problems in the relationship. So in a sense, it's the same thing here, is that we have to deliberately make those deposits in the customer's emotional bank account, because at times we're going to have to make a withdrawal, and we need to make sure we have enough balance to make that withdrawal.
Excellent. And Sam asked a question about best practices for demonstrating trust throughout the customer lifecycle. Now, you've talked about these 5 moments and some other concepts. Is there anything that you would add in regards to customer success best practices that really help throughout the customer lifecycle?
Yeah, and I did. I'm in a role right now where I'm VP Customer Success for simPRO. But prior to doing that, I actually did a lot of consulting with some Colorado tech companies all around the state here in Colorado, and it always amazed me of all the clever things that people were doing at different times to really do these things and to stitch them together. And there are a lot of best practices. In fact, tomorrow night, we're hearing a presentation about customer communities, and I'm a big fan of that. I mean, if you want to have a scalable kind of experience for customers, a light touch or a tech touch way of doing things, building customer communities, I think is brilliant. And there's not a whole lot of companies that do that well. Our presenter tomorrow night is actually going to be WebRoot, and they've done just an amazing job of that. And it's a way for them, for customers to get involved. They kind of take a page out of the book of Stack Overflow, where they have customers that talk about and share best practices about security. And folks are recognized for what they share with other customers, and they earn badges, so there's status involved with that. And yeah, they do moderate these groups, and if someone says something that's not technically true, they may come in and make a correction. But in this way, customers are sharing their own experience with each other. And it's a great way for them to provide a level of service and support for customers without a whole lot of labor, just by letting the customers do that themselves. So I think it's really a brilliant strategy. And one of the things that we're looking at is how do we do that same thing even at different phases of the customer life cycle. So for example, when customers are fairly new, why not have learning cohorts? Why not have people get together that are at certain phases of learning the product and have them work with each other and do some moderation with a customer success person? And then once they achieve a certain level of capability on their own, then graduate them to the larger group. So there may be some really interesting ways that that we can use communities, and I think there's some clever things that we can do there.
Excellent. Roger has a question that I think we got to answer here. And he asks, how do you build or maintain trust with the customer when the customer may not be trustworthy?
That's a great question, because I mean, it's funny. It's psychologists will tell us that somewhere between 1% and 3% of the population are sociopaths, right? So that there are people out here that are really bad people, and half of 1% are downright criminals. So we're going to run into people that don't share our values and may not be trustworthy. And just like in our personal relationships, who we are is who we are, and we extend that hand and we act in a trustworthy manner until someone acts in a way that's contrary to that. And then obviously we have to take a different strategy. And it's the same thing with our customers. I mean, there are certain customers out there that it's good to see them go and good to refer them to a competitor. And once they kind of show their true nature, then we know where they stand. We can't control other people. It's one of those truths in life, and something that I think you learn if you're in a committed relationship is that you can't change someone else. Yeah, the only thing that you can change is yourself. And if you want that other person to change their behavior, you need to change your behavior. But that only takes you so far. I mean, you have to assume that the other person is as committed to that relationship as you are. If it turns out that they're not, then you have a different problem. And it's the same thing in business. So I think you go out there with your best foot, you try to do your best to build that trust, and let the chips fall where they may.
Sure. And it is no surprise that everybody has different priorities and a different view of things. And so as we are working with very different types of clients and personalities made up of different individuals, we put ourselves in the best chance to build trust with them when we're doing the right things, and that trust hopefully will be reciprocated. So Ed, love to show the audience members how they can get started.
Sure.
And kind of where to start if they'd like to build greater trust with their customers.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, I got a little 5-step process here. If we go to the next slide. One of the things that I highly recommend for folks is that they map their customer journey. If they haven't done this already, is map out your customer's experience. And do so from their perspective, not from your perspective. And that's one of the hardest parts of this, is when we map out a process, when we look at workflows and things like that, we tend to say, well, this is what it looks like from my end, or this is what I do. It's most important to think about it from the perspective of what does this look like from their vantage point, and not only what are they trying to accomplish, what are their goals and objectives at each phase of this, but how should they feel about it? What is their experience when they're encountering something new, and understanding what are the emotional needs as well as the logical needs. So that's really the first step there, is to map the customer journey from your customer's perspective. The second one is to really map your current business processes against that. So if you know what the customer experience is and you have that mapped out, what are you doing? What is your current process? And compare that to the customer journey. That is going to suggest a number of gaps, right? You're going to see right away of, oh, a customer is at this point in time, they're looking for this information. When we look at our own process, we're not providing that information. So just the action of going through and mapping out, looking at what you're doing compared to what your customer needs is going to uncover gaps and some really obvious things. The next step after that is really to look at brainstorming. How can we enhance these 5 critical moments that we talked about before? Moments of connection, moments of power, moments of proof, moments of wow, and moments of truth. So when we think about that, are there some ways that we can make that more systematic? Is there a way that we can make that more repeatable? And is there a way that we can really amplify that experience for our customers? That's going to generate a number of gaps as well, and opportunities, and some new ways of doing things, like I mentioned before, with communities or with in-product data dashboards that show how you're doing. There's any host of things that you could do that's specific to your customers, to your product, to your market, that make a lot of sense. And then the last thing is just really to go ahead and make those improvements. I spent a lot of years in consulting, and it's great. We go in and do set up, go through this whole mapping exercise, and we come up with a list of improvements, and we prioritize that list. But things don't change just because you have a list. You actually have to go out there and execute. And one of the things that really separates high-performing organizations from those that are kind of mediocre, the high-performing organizations will execute. You have a list of things, they go and they get it done. And that's the real difference. Once you have a list, once you have a set of things that you can go do and improve the customer experience, turn the crank and make it happen. The key here is being systematic. A great definition of something that's systematic comes from the Baldrige program. And they define systematic as something that's well-ordered, it's repeatable, and it uses data and information so learning is possible. And if you think about these key critical moments in the customer experience, can you make those systematic? Can you make them repeatable? Can you make them well-ordered? Can you measure that and understand what impact did I make, and can I improve that? And you don't have to have 100 moments. You just need to have a few that are really meaningful, in the right place at the right time for the right reasons, and that's going to help reinforce and show the customer that you can be trusted. They will learn from that, and they'll be much more loyal to you as a result.
I do have one more question here that I'd like to answer before we wrap up. And Justin asked if your recommendation is to map each unique customer's journey as part of a CS engagement, or to create a single journey map that represents your customer success journeys in aggregate?
That's a great question. The work that I've done in the past and I've done here at simPRO is to really think in terms of really two things. One is markets, and the other is personas. So a market is, are there particular market segments that you're dealing with that may have different needs? You know, maybe 80% of it's the same, but there's some marked differences between dealing with customers in one segment or another. So look at it first by segment, and then secondly by personas. Because you may be dealing, a lot of times if we're in B2B sales, there are multiple actors in that engagement, either pre or post sales. You're going to have a champion, you may have an economic buyer, you may have users, you may have technical buyers, people who will evaluate your solution, but won't be actually using it on a day-to-day basis. So you have all these different buying influences, and all of them have a journey. So part of what I think is really scalable and useful for companies is to map out by segment what does that journey look like, and then at each one of those phases ask the question, what are my personas doing? So what's my economic buyer doing? What's my technical buyer? What's my user buyer doing? And make sure you have a solution for each of those during those phases. If you have a template that you use that addresses 80% of how it works, you've got a good working template. When you go through your process of discovery with a new customer, it's important to note, well, you know, this is what's different. This is how our customer doesn't, you know, exactly fit our operating model. They do things a little bit differently. I'm gonna make note of that in my CRM. And when I interact with that customer, I know that there's a couple of key differences I need to keep in mind. So do what's practical. You know, this is a whole organization working together, so you don't want to have a ton of maps, but have one that gets you 80% of the way there and is tailored at least to your segments and to your personas. And you know, just make notes about those key differences and go from there. And I think you'll be very happy with the results of that.
Excellent. Thank you for that very thorough answer. Ed, any closing comments here in regards to the trust framework?
No, I would just add to everybody that this is something that I think is a brand new way of thinking about relationships with customers. You know, I think we all tend to be very technology focused because we're in software. Most of us on this call are in that business. We're technically oriented, we're function oriented, we're very product centric. Our organizations tend to be that way. In customer success and in sales, the orientation changes a little bit. We tend to be a little bit more focused on customers, and we need to blend both of those. And we never can lose sight of the fact that you know, we're all people. Business is about people. And to the extent that we really understand for every new customer that we interact with, there's an opportunity there. In those first 60, 90 days of that relationship, it goes far beyond, can you use my product? Are you using my product? Are you getting results from that? Are other people in your organization getting those results? We need to be concerned about that experience. Are they learning to trust us, our company, our technology? Are we helping them through that change process every step of the way, especially in the early go? If we leave that to chance, we're going to pay the penalty for that. If we do that very systematically, very deliberately, very attentively, we will ramp up that level of trust, and you know, retention is going to be a no-brainer. We're going to get that affective commitment. You know, problems always happen. Customers will respond much more positively if we do that. And I think this is going to make our businesses much more successful and much more prosperous if we focus on this aspect of trust.
Well, thank you, Ed. As I mentioned previously, a recorded version of this webinar will be emailed to you. And I'd also like to mention that Client Success is here to help. We are very, very passionate about helping you deliver value for your customers through customer success processes. And we sure value the expertise that Ed has brought to the table today, and hope you appreciate it as well. Because of our passion for customer success, we've built industry-leading technology to help you. And our technology has won multiple awards and is ranked #1 in usability and in time to value on G2 Crowd. We have a lot of other resources available, and I'd highly recommend visiting our blog or requesting a demo at clientsuccess.com. Ed, thank you sincerely again.
Thank you, Brent. It's great being with you.
Awesome. And to all of our attendees, thank you for joining us today. Look forward to having you join us for future webinars. Thanks again.